Well, today we're in Psalm chapter 32. And as you're studying the Psalms and you see the prayers of David, you just see this current of emotions from anger to grief to mourning to sorrow to gladness. And in this psalm, it's a prayer to God, confessing his sins and seeking forgiveness. And so it's a challenging thing, and it's probably a subject that we don't give enough attention to. But let's begin in Psalm chapter 32 and begin in verse 1 and 2. That's all we're going to look at today. But Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man whom the Lord does not impute his iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. Now, the Bible mentions, at least in this chapter, three or four different ideas about sin. We sometimes think that sin is sort of encompasses everything. And I want you to see this today, the difference between sin and iniquity, and the difference between iniquity and transgression. But when you start this particular psalm, you'll notice David says, blessed. And I think that that word is often misunderstood. And so your translation may say happy, and that's not bad. But let me try to clarify something. It's good to be forgiven objectively. And I want you to ponder that thought just a little bit today about why it is good to be forgiven. But if you take happiness subjectively, which I think must follow something objectively, and I don't mean to get too confusing here, but to be blessed objectively means there's a sense of well being. You're fortunate and highly favored of God. You're in a good state and a good position before God. And, the Greeks would talk about a man that's blessed who had a lot of money, or we might say a man who is to be envied, and a man who has longevity of life, who's lived a long life, or has good health. And it's interesting, I think, that in the amplified version of this chapter, it says, blessed or fortunate is the man, and then adds the phrase to be envied, because we envy people who live long sometimes, and we envy people who have a lot of money and just have life pretty good. I mean, they got it pretty good. And so the idea of being blessed, though, is that you're in a good state and a good position before God. Now, the way we use happiness, which sometimes is used in this word, we think of it as being subjective, and that's good, as long as there's something objectively true. Are you tracking me so far? And so it sure is good to be forgiven. And it is also feels good to be forgiven. That is, to be happy and rejoicing about that, to that emotion of feeling great about it. And I think it's important to note too, as we look at this particular verse, that if we look at forgiveness lightly, and some do, in fact, many do, you're not going to discover the joy of forgiveness, nor will you appreciate and have gratitude of being forgiven. Now, let me say that again. If you do look at forgiveness as a light thing, because it isn't, you will never discover the joy of being forgiven. In fact, I think the angels know a little bit more about the magnitude of us being forgiven than we do. In fact, the Bible even speaks about the angels rejoicing in heaven when one man repents. And so I think we need to have a fuller idea about forgiveness, and then we'll appreciate it more, and it will impact our life more, and we'll have a great sense of gladness gladness when we understand that we have been forgiven, that our sins have been removed. And I want to say something else too here, because as you look at the idea of forgiveness, especially with David, you'll see that he's not interested in just simply having a clean slate. That is just his sins being removed and sent away. That's the idea of remission. But more than that, deeper than that, because it had all to do with having the right relationship with God and the desire to be reconciled to God. And so forgiveness was much more weighty than just simply having your sins forgiven. And I think sometimes that's all folks want. They're not interested going any deeper or any further. And that's a great mistake. So he begins by saying, fortunate is the man. Oh, he sure is in a good place and he's happy about it. And you're going to see a little later in the Psalms that we'll talk about tonight, before he was forgiven, he was a miserable soul. I mean, you want to talk about unhappiness day after day, however long it lingered, he was miserable. And so there sure is a good feeling when you are forgiven, and you ought to be glad. And again, the deeper we understand what forgiveness is all about, then we'll get a glimpse of that. That's why I started by saying there's such a current of emotions in the Psalms and in David's prayer to God. So blessed is the man, he begins to say, notice this, there are three or four things he says about sin, and you just can't throw everything he says about sin in one camp, because he talks first about transgression, and then he talks about sin. He uses the word sin, and then he talks about iniquity, and they're not the same. They don't have the same meaning, and they don't mean the same. And so let's look at this for just a moment today, and here's what he says about transgression. Now, transgression sometimes is translated trespass, and I don't know, but when I was a kid, I could remember seeing signs that says no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I didn't know what that prosecution was. There was an old farmer I heard about. He had a big old apple orchard, and he had that sign up there, and people told me when I was a kid he'd shoot you with salt rock. And you certainly didn't want that to happen. But you see signs, especially some of you fellows that get out in the woods and you're out there hunting, and you'll see properties that say no trespassing. And so to trespass is doing something that you ought not to do. In other words, the idea is a prohibition. And the transgression is when you do something that you're not supposed to do. You were told not to do it, and you do exactly what you're doing. Oh, so many brethren want to talk about sin as if they didn't know what they're doing. And I think about 99.9% we did know what we were doing. Most of the sins we do commit are deliberate. We know exactly what we're doing. David knew what he did and why he did it. And so the first idea, of course, is to do what God has prohibited. You all know the story back in the beginning when Adam and Eve were in the garden. God had said to them in Genesis chapter 2, he put them in a garden. We call it the Garden of Eden, and it was a paradise. They could eat of any fruit of the tree. I mean, I don't know how many trees were there and how many different kinds of fruit, but you think about it. But he said there was one tree, the tree of good and evil, the tree of knowledge, that they were prohibited against eating of. And so they did what God told them not to do. Now, you just think about it for just a moment. I don't think you have to ponder on this too long, but most of us know that we have done some things that God has prohibited us doing. We knew exactly what he said, and we did it anyhow. Do you understand that when God entered into that covenant with Israel in Exodus chapter 20, you remember that the 10 Commandments, they all said, thou shalt not. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And so they weren't to do some things. Of course, they ended up doing all of it anyhow. So the idea of a transgression, I want you to understand, it's doing what you are not supposed to do, what has been prohibited doing. And we don't have to think too long on this because all of us have done that. Then notice this, he uses the word sin secondly. And that word sin refers to, in the King James or in the New Testament Greek understanding of the word, it's a picture word. That's what would come to your mind when you would use the word sin. It would always refer to either missing the mark or falling short of the mark. An old archer, let me just tell you my story. When I was a boy, we didn't have new stuff. If you wanted to have a bow and arrow, you'd go out and get a stick, and one that was pliable. You'd have a little bit of a string. It wasn't really a bowstring, but you'd find some old string, and then you'd get some sticks as straight as ones as you could find, and then you'd try to shoot arrows with that. I want to tell you something. Most of those arrows didn't go very far. You could never hit the target with those things. Fact is, you didn't even know what direction half the time they were going in. And so the idea of missing the mark is falling short of it. You shoot an arrow and it doesn't make the mark, or it misses the mark. So notice this. Transgression, of course, is doing what God told us not to do, and to sin is to fail to do what God has required us to do. And boy, I tell you what, I think there's probably a lot more sin on this side than on the other side. What do you think? Because we all know that we have failed to do many things that God has required us to do, even getting down to just something simple about loving your neighbor, or even think about the challenge about forgiving one another. And so there's a whole lot of things in the list that we know to do good and not to do good is sin. And so here's the problem is a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves and we're sincere about this, have failed to do what God has required us to do. Now the third word that's used, and it's an awful word. He uses the word iniquity. Sometimes it's just translated wickedness, but it actually means perverted. And you're twisting things and perverting things. We use the word to a person whose character is perverted. And that's the idea. In fact, the Bible will even talk about the iniquity of sin sometimes, referring to the character of the sin. And of course, we don't have to look too far out into the world today, seeing how many things have been perverted, especially in the realm of morality. And so a lot of things have been perverted. Now, I want you to think, because we're not going to spend much more time in that, but this is rather a sad story, because in Romans chapter 3 and verse 10, we've all sinned and there's none righteous, no, not one. I was thinking of Romans 3:23 when I was saying that. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And so here's the problem. Boy, we got a real mess here, because we're all guilty. We've all transgressed. We've all done some things that we shouldn't have done. We've all committed, a sin. We failed to do oftentimes what we're supposed to do. And then, of course, there's iniquity, and that gets into a realm. I hope that we haven't fallen in too much. But no matter how you look at it, we've all sinned. And now the problem is, you see, when we start to really get into this, it's not a light matter at all, because the God who created us to be walking with him, to be reconciled with him, to be with one with him, to be at peace with him. And so the problem is sin separates us from God, and there's not a thing that we can do on our own to make that thing any better. And so God's going to have to do something. Now, I'm going to leave you there today, because I want you to understand, boy, if you get into sin and it's not taken care of, there's some real problems, and it certainly isn't something to trifle with. And so we're going to look tonight at, I hope you're back with me, because we're going to talk about how in the world are we going to deal with this, because we're guilty of sin, we're guilty of transgression, and oftentimes we're guilty of iniquity, and we better be careful, because David will say, blessed is the man where there's no deceit in him, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later tonight. But I hope you'll be back with me. I hope you're staying with me in the Psalms. We're going to learn so much as we go through this journey together, and I hope it's been benefit to you, because we're going to learn a great deal about our relationship to God. So I'll see you tonight, and if not tonight, I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.